Mr. Creepy.
The storyteller.
I've become the blade that knows no mercy. Instead, I know the dance of blood and the whispers of death, which fade into a deafening silence. A warm noise of blood flows into the chasm of time, the knife of silence. That is what he calls me, the one who listens to me every night, who cleanses me of the thoughts of the world and plunges me deeper into the despair. I was born in flames and stuck by the hammer, my steel carrying within me implacable destiny. I was supposed to be a mere object, a tool meant to bring order to the chaos of daily life. And each night that passed, I lay on the shelf in forgotten store, a relic where light barely pierced through, as if the sun refuses to touch this old, tired building. Once the store had white walls, but the imprint of time covered them with a thick layer of mold and dust, and the ceiling, cracked and stained, it seemed ready to collapse at any moment. The shelves had become the prey of termites, often empty and sorrowful, crackling at every touch of the air. A flickering light bulb barely held off the darkness, swaying gently in an invisible breeze. The smell was that of forgotten things, of wet wood and years of neglect. Everything felt as though time itself has retreated from this place, leaving it in a state of slow, painful decay. I was a prisoner, just like the other objects, abandoning any hope of escape. The shopkeeper was merely a shadow of a man, old, bowed under the weight of his years, always behind the counter on a crinkly chair with a gaze lost somewhere far away. He admitted the loneliness of the place, and his soul was weighed down by the burden of years that had passed. His face was etched with deep wrinkles. His eyes were dim, covered by a veil of exhaustion and resignation. It seemed as if he'd forgotten how to speak, for he has rarely uttered a word. And those who enter the store often look at him with either pity or disgust. His gnarled, trembling hands move slowly, endless, rearranging the same useless objects day after day. A ritual that never ended, creating a comforting routine, I guess, for both him and me. A knife like any other, laying on a forgotten shelf. When he looked at me, it seemed as though he saw me as just another object. Yet, in his quiet, sad way, I believe he understood me. We were both prisoners of the forgotten place, condemned to fade away without leaving any trace. In that store, time did not pass. There was no dreams, no hopes, only a pressing despair and an endless wait. But one moonless night, everything changed. Heavy footsteps pierced the oppressive silence, interrupting the rhythm of his dead eternity. His silent entrance became a storm, tearing through the air. I felt my blade tremble lightly, anticipating something I could not yet understand. His empty gaze found me immediately, as if he knew I was there, waiting to become chosen. I knew he was different from the others who've come and gone, who've looked at me and walked away, people who ignored the suffocating silence of this place, rushing after the illusion of life. He moved slowly, with cold determination, an invisible attraction that I felt like a deepening tension. He reached out, and his cold, long fingers gripped my handle with a terrifying familiarity. He freed me from the cage of dusty shelf. And as he lifted me, a shiver ran through my blade. Not fear, but a shiver of home and anticipation. I was no longer a mere object, a victim of a numbed existence. I had become alive, ready to plunge into the fatal dance of fate. His gaze, reflected in the mirror of my soul, was devoid of emotion, with a darkness that seemed to swallow everything. He had a face that looked as though it had been pulled from the darkness of nightmares, marked by deep shadows. We left into the cold night, he with his heavy steps and I silent and motionless, yet more alive than ever. I could have said that I had known my destiny in that instant, but no. His life thread had already been knotted, and our fates were entwined. The journey to his home felt like a distance into a nightmare, like a slow fall into a world where time and space seemed suspended. The night air was dense, oppressive, soaked with whispers that he spoke like a creed, a prayer to the ghost of the past. The streets were abandoned, weighed down by an exhaustion of world that no longer cared if it trampled over its own end. Each shadow cast by pale lanterns, distorted on the pavement, followed us as we walked. The wind shook the dry leaves as the trees and blew side by side and brought them into our path, hissing through the corners of the old buildings, which seemed to sigh in the night silence like a sweet song. The sense of unease grew stronger, and the buildings gradually shed the beauty of the sun, their windows covered only by dust and cobwebs, watching us with hollow eyes like mute witnesses. From time to time, the distant barking of a stray dog could be heard, but the sound quickly faded, swallowed by the vast silence surrounding us. The abandoned factory glared at us from its dead shell. His house was nothing but a reflection of his soul, a ruin, a place where nothing living remained, only broken memories and deafening silence that urged any soul towards oblivion. In front of his house lay the darkness that snuffed out any trace of life. A lion with hollow eyes and a stone mane, shredded by rust, stood as a guardian of the underworld, foretelling that anyone who entered there would not leave alive. The door creaked open with a strong, sinister sound, like a growl from the bowels of the earth. He did not stop. He kept walking until he reached an almost empty room, a table in the corner and a half-burnt candle. That was all. I sensed his excitement, though not nervousness, and I felt him gently place me on the table. I had become a sacred object to him. Laughing, he sat on the floor and pulled a chest from beneath the table, from which he held his trophies, a ring stained with rust, an old brooch, a shawl torn and stained with deep marks of despair and blood. He arranged them before me on the table with obsession and precision, as if he was presenting them to an old friend. He remembered every name, every face, every voice. Suddenly, his obsession and his laughter turned into strings at the memories that haunted him. They're not real. They're not real. Or maybe they are. Doubt consumed his mind, and I, his trusted blade, was always close by. Sometimes he grasped my handle, but his touch would suddenly become a caress. Try again. Set yourself free. I was seen as a final solution when he lifted me and clenched me. And I could feel the thrill of anticipation. I realized that every murder he committed was just a desperate attempt to serve any ties with loose voices, trying to sever them and disconnect them, to lock them away forever. But he will always leave me back on the table. They know, they see, they are coming for you. His streams seemed to strike the walls, stretched with various words, each more confusing than the last. We are one. We all die at some point. We're the most common. The voices echoed like distorted vibrations, feeding his paranoia. I saw him caught between fantasy and reality, from which he began to detach more and more. Why don't they disappear? Why are they still here? He looked at me with despair and moments of lunacy when he remembered that he had once been an ordinary man. When the voices did not follow him at every step, when he wasn't a prisoner of his own mind, he remembered fragments, a window open to a warm room, the faces of loved ones, his wife in her floral robe, his child dabbling, filling his heart with happiness, friends who shared laughter and stories from the past. These were rare moments of clarity when he recalled that it was like a hole being filled. Without the chaos in his mind, it was peace. He remembered how the sun used to stream through the window and warmth would envelop him and bringing a peace he now desperately sought. But suddenly, his world would crumble. The faces full of joy would become stained with blood, and the voices would start growling at him, word by word. Before me, crouched on the floor, he whispered, like a prayer to God who had abandoned him. The cold shadows of the past began and became more aggressive. I could hear them more and more clearly. The rusty ring belonged to his wife, who one of the voices had taken from him with the promise of release. That night, he believed that if he ended her suffering, all the madness would cease. You saw her, didn't you? How the blood thickens down her angelic face. How her voice faded away. But the others continued. That night, he fell prey to the worst illusion that he would find peace. But instead of silence, the voices multiplied. Reality and fantasy intertwined, and like a knife was the silent witness to his agony. He lifted me from the table and gripped me with a fury born from despair. The voices grew stronger, and another face took shape in his eyes. Another ghost from the past. Another victim who were time scorched. She had become familiar to him, and he began to weep and beg for forgiveness. But the voice of the face began to stream and curse him, and from its eyes flowed streams of bloody tears. You will never escape. You are part of you. We are part of you. We are all that you have left. The image seemed to swell before him, filling the entire room with its presence. There is no forgiveness for you. He trembled, crushed by memories and weighed by his deeds, clutching me tighter. He knew that I was his only remaining solution. Suddenly, the woman's face vanished, but in the other corner of the room, it transferred into a crib from which came the wailing of a child, a cry of desperation that had never had a chance to turn into words. The search for his mother had found no path to life but to death. Defined by voices, another knife had found its way into his heart. The sound became wrenching, like the laminate of life wasted in time. His gaze fixed on me, turned towards the shadows of the past. My child, please forgive me. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to lose you. The bloodstained shawl was in fact a swaddling cloth for the one who was supposed to be his child. The objects were not trophies, but his link to reality, a harsh reminder of the voices which he had reduced to mystifying silence. But in that crib, the voices grew louder, soaked with the mix of fury and despair, and the grip in which he held me became suffocating. The desire to end it all turning into a clear goal. He sought release desperately and became the object of his tragic ending. Before my blade unfolded and observed the theater in which the agony of his crimes were unstoppable, where he was mere secondary character. The dance of reality and illusion grew more and more frantic, for his mind was caught in a whirlwind of memories and hallucinations. The chorus of the underworld pushed him towards the edge of the abyss. Suddenly, everything became quiet. The voices abruptly fell silent, and the whole world seemed to slow down. I could no longer find a trace of his crimes, agony, or the despair of the voices in his mind. It was just him, with a lost gaze. Before him, the air took the form of a beautiful woman, a young girl dressed in a black gown, with skin white as milk and black hair that seemed to foretell the end. She took the hand in which he held me and guided me towards his chest. Battered by the burden of life born from chaos, the tip of my blade pierced his skin, and she pushed me gently. The final moments felt like the prelude to his release. The woman with the face of death looked at me with a cold tenderness, a caress that promised peace, not punishment. You know what you have to do. At last, you will be free. I saw him as he sought peace, and I was the magical object that paved the way into that void. I felt his body gradually give away as I wrapped myself in his warm blood. Each beat of his heart became an embrace and turned into a distant echo, like a final breath. His eyes looked at me, and with a sad smile, his face turned towards the woman who brought him peace. Forgiveness, forgiveness. He whispered those words not only for those who had lost, but for himself, for the mistakes that he had marked his own existence with. In that moment, in that final look, I felt how his pain and despair transformed into a deep peace he had sought for so long. The silence was now complete, without the voices that tormented him, without the ghost of the past that growled at him and at his mind. I, the knife of silence, had been the quiet witness to his fall. And along with this last breath, I felt that he had been freed from the cycle of suffering. In that silent room, everything became still. For me, the burden of carrying the peace of those who had freed remains. I do not take lives, but I carry their silence with me. And now I carry his as well. My cold limb, clothed in blood, is the silent witness to his end. This is the burden I will always carry within me until someone else finds me and takes me from a forgotten shelf. And I will dance again in the light of shadows. For him, it was all over. But for me, the dance continues, wrapped in the silence, carrying the peace that only death can bring.